The early morning light barely touched the edges of the quiet suburban street in Fort Collins, Colorado, as Robert Kincaid locked the front door of his modest home for what he hoped would be a fresh beginning. He paused for a moment to glance over the driveway where his green Subaru Outback sat, waiting already packed with neatly stacked bags, water jugs, road snacks, and a folded-up tent strapped to the roof rack. It had been a hard year. A year defined by absence marked by the loss of a wife who had once filled that house with color laughter and steady reassurance. Robert took a deep breath and turned toward his daughters Emily and June, who were buckling themselves into the back seat. Emily, 13, and growing into her mother's fierce independence, adjusted her earbuds and gave her father a quick thumbs up. June, only 7, was humming to herself, her fingers wrapped around a stuffed red fox. This wasn't just a road trip. It was supposed to be the beginning of healing. They were heading to a family reunion in Flagstaff, Arizona, a plan set months ago by Robert's sister, who insisted that being around family would be good for the girls. Robert wasn't sure he agreed, but he also wasn't sure of anything anymore. After the funeral, everything had blurred into a series of autopiloted motions. Wake up, make lunches, manage classroom lessons, attend counseling appointments, cry quietly while doing the dishes. Emily had stopped talking about her mother entirely. June had started drawing people with their eyes shut. The reunion felt like something solid to grasp onto, a reason to get in the car and drive through America's open landscapes, where maybe silence could give them space to feel something again. Robert had mapped out the route with care, noting state parks and lookout points along the way. He even printed an old-school backup map in case his GPS lost signal. It made him feel like he was in control. The first leg of the trip was smooth, almost deceptively so. They passed through Colorado Springs by mid-morning and hit the New Mexico border by lunch. The mood inside the car was light, or at least lighter than it had been in months. Emily occasionally looked up from her phone to point out odd rock formations or signs she found funny. June asked questions about everything they saw, from the shape of the clouds to whether animals in the desert had best friends. Robert answered patiently, happy to hear her voice, and glad that for once the rearview mirror reflected more than just weary faces. He felt that maybe, just maybe, they were doing something right. The idea of camping for a night before reaching Flagstaff had been Robert's idea, meant to turn the trip into more of an adventure and less of a chore. He found a spot near the Utah-Arizona border, nestled just off an old scenic bypass he'd read about in a travel blog. They reached the small town of Green River around 3 p.m. Robert fueled up, checked the tires, and bought the girls popsicles from the dusty roadside convenience store. Inside, a young cashier with a friendly smile offered him a paper flyer listing scenic routes and camping recommendations. One particular route, labeled as a local favorite, cut through the edge of a lesser-known canyon and led directly to a camping area by a dried riverbed. It wasn't on Robert's printed map, but the idea of a quieter, less crowded detour appealed to him. He thanked the cashier, tucked the flyer into his back pocket, and decided to take the suggested route. Outside, he handed June a coloring book and told Emily to keep an eye out for the turnoff marked by an old metal sign with a buffalo etched into the surface. Neither of them questioned it. In fact, the girls seemed to enjoy the sudden feeling of spontaneity. It made the trip feel more like an adventure. The road began to narrow about 30 minutes after leaving the gas station. The pavement gave way to gravel and then to hard-packed dirt. Robert wasn't concerned. The Outback had been reliable in worse conditions, and the sky above was clear blue with only the faintest whisper of clouds near the horizon. They passed an old weather-beaten sign with the image of a buffalo and an arrow pointing west. Emily pointed it out, and Robert turned the wheel confidently. The road dipped between tall, dry ridges and followed a natural slope that opened into a flat basin. It was quiet here, almost unnaturally so. The only sound was the steady crunch of tires against dirt and the soft whisper of wind over the sagebrush. Robert glanced at the dashboard clock. It was a little after 5. The sun still had time before it sank behind the cliffs, and he estimated they were no more than an hour from the campsite. June had fallen asleep with her head against the window, her red fox tucked under her chin. Emily had started taking photos with an old Polaroid she found in a box in the garage. Robert hadn't realized she packed it, but now he was glad she did. She clicked a photo of the road, stretching ahead, and set it on the dashboard to develop. Robert felt a flicker of satisfaction. The girls were adjusting. They were moving forward. He was doing what fathers were supposed to do. Then the first jolt hit. It was small, barely more than a bump, but it jarred the vehicle enough to wake June and make Robert tighten his grip on the steering wheel. A few moments later came another jolt, sharper this time, and then a scraping noise. Robert slowed the car and rolled to a stop. Ahead, the road narrowed to a trench carved by water runoff and erosion. It looked passable from a distance, but now showed its true form: uneven ground, loose rocks, deep crevices. Robert stepped out and walked a few feet ahead. The road continued, but twisted sharply around a steep drop-off. There were no guardrails, no signs, and no cell reception. He squatted and ran his hand over the dry ground. It was solid in places, crumbling in others. The route didn't look as promising up close. He looked back at the car, at the wide eyes of his daughters, watching him silently from the back seat, and felt the first twinge of doubt. He could turn around. It would take time, and they'd arrive at the campsite after dark. Or they could press on, hoping the road leveled out ahead. He stood there a moment longer before brushing off his jeans and walking back to the driver's side. He didn't know then that the choice he was about to make would never let them see the reunion. That from this point forward, every decision would edge them closer to becoming a question no one could answer for 15 years. The Subaru crept forward into the narrowing track, its tires sinking slightly into the powdery sand as Robert Kincaid leaned forward in his seat. The landscape had shifted almost imperceptibly. The red rocks stood taller, more jagged. The flat terrain they had been driving through now rolled unevenly, patterned with faint washouts and dry crevices. The sun dropped lower in the sky, casting slanted shadows that made distances harder to judge. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other tapping against his leg, a quiet rhythm of doubt he would not voice. The road in front of them, if it could still be called a road, sloped gradually upward, then dipped behind a sharp bend that disappeared behind a wall of boulders. He knew that backtracking now would mean camping in an unmarked stretch of desert with no water source, no listed coordinates, and no idea how far back the last familiar junction had been. He pressed forward slowly, hoping for some landmark or opening just beyond the curve that would affirm his decision. He told himself it was temporary. Just a bad stretch. It would level out. In the back seat, Emily finally removed one earbud and looked ahead through the windshield. Her voice was calm but edged with concern. She asked if this was still the road from the map. Robert replied with a measured tone, assuring her it was just a shortcut, and that these back roads often looked rough before opening up. She seemed unconvinced, but leaned back again, pulling her hood up. June had woken up sometime during the climb, and now sat quietly holding her stuffed fox close. Her gaze moved from window to window, watching the desert pass by in slow motion. Her fingers tapped against the glass, tracing lines through the dust. Robert kept his eyes forward. He adjusted his speed and followed the shallow tracks that wound through the sand. The steering wheel jerked slightly as they passed over a jagged rock, sending a thump through the undercarriage. He exhaled and muttered to himself, checking the dashboard for warning lights. Nothing blinked. He kept going. They drove another 10 minutes before reaching a flat rise where the trail widened briefly and gave a view of the basin below. From this point, the land dropped sharply into a shallow canyon marked by dry brush and patches of brittle grass. The terrain looked deceptively passable. The dirt path continued on the other side, faint but visible. A few scattered wooden posts stood in the distance, remnants of something once marked, now forgotten. Robert parked the car and stepped out. The air was dry and still, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. He walked a few paces forward, trying to gauge the slope. It looked rough, but manageable. He returned to the car and pulled out the printed flyer from the glove box. The route described on the paper mentioned scenic overlooks and quiet stretches, but no warning about road conditions. He turned it over. The back was blank. Back in the driver's seat, Robert took another glance at the clock. The sun was close to the horizon. It would be dark in under an hour. Turning around would mean retracing the path in fading light. Going forward might get them back on pavement faster if the road behaved. He chose forward again. The vehicle eased down the slope, the tires gripping tightly to the dirt and scattered rock. Each bump sent a small jolt through the cabin, but the Subaru held steady. They reached the bottom of the incline, and the road ahead stretched into a narrow canyon carved between ridges. The rock walls on either side were steep rising like silent walls. There was no traffic, no sound of other engines, no signal on the cell phone. Inside the canyon, the air cooled quickly. The rocks had absorbed heat all day, and now the shadows spread long and deep. Robert drove slowly, eyes scanning for any sharp turns or drops. The path narrowed to the width of the vehicle in places, forcing him to edge carefully around loose gravel and dry shrubs. Emily had stopped drawing. Her sketchbook lay closed on her lap. June asked if they were almost there, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert answered yes, but even as he said it, he knew he was guessing. The canyon made it hard to see more than a few hundred feet ahead. Every curve looked the same. They reached a place where the road had split. The left fork climbed upward between two outcrops. The right dipped gently, then curved behind another rise. No signs marked the junction. Robert stopped again. He stepped out and walked a few yards up the left fork. It grew steeper quickly and looked washed out in several sections. He turned back, choosing the right fork. It looked smoother and wider, and the fading light seemed to fall more naturally in that direction. He backed into the driver's seat, shifted into drive, and turned the wheel. The new stretch of road looked promising at first. It curved gently around the rocks, following the contour of a dry wash. The dirt beneath them was hard-packed, and the slope evened out. Robert allowed himself to believe they were close. Then the road began to fade, not suddenly, but in degrees. The dirt thinned, the edges became softer. Low brush crept inward from the sides. Tire tracks became faint, then they disappeared. He slowed the car, unsure if they had missed a turn or if the path had simply vanished. The road now looked more like a trail. He stopped. He stepped out again and walked ahead. The land sloped down toward a dried stream bed, its banks edged by small boulders and patches of dead grass. It was clear that the road had not been maintained. Not recently, maybe not ever. He turned in a slow circle, scanning for markers. There were none. No fences, no signs, no tire marks except for their own. The air smelled like dust and sun-baked stone. He walked back to the car, dust clinging to his boots. Inside, Emily looked at him without speaking. June yawned, clutching her fox tighter. Robert sat for a long moment. The dashboard light glowed faintly. He switched off the engine. The silence returned in full. There was no sound but the cooling engine and the distant chirp of a bird. He told the girls they would camp here for the night. It was safer than moving in the dark. Emily did not argue. June nodded sleepily. He stepped out again and opened the rear hatch. He unfolded the tent as quickly as he could, the dry ground resisting each stake he drove into the dirt. He laid out the sleeping bag, set the cooler by the flap, and started the small camping stove. The wind was light, but it stirred the dust with each breath. As the sky faded into twilight, the stars began to emerge one by one, cold and distant. The night settled slowly, pressing its quiet weight over the canyon like a lid. The last glow of sunlight had disappeared beyond the western cliffs, and the stars emerged with a kind of cold indifference. Robert sat by the tent's entrance knees, bent hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm instant coffee. The small camping stove had long since been turned off, its heat fading into the dusty air. Inside the tent, Emily and June had fallen asleep. Emily lay curled in her sleeping bag, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. June clutched her red fox, closer breathing, soft and steady. Robert remained outside, staring at the dark slope beyond their makeshift camp. He had expected a view of the open desert, or maybe the distant headlights of some passing car. Instead, there was only blackness. No light, no sound, just the low murmur of wind brushing against rock and sand. He checked his phone again as if it might have changed its mind. No signal. Not even a flicker. He turned it off to save battery and slipped it into his jacket pocket. His thoughts wandered toward the road behind them. He replayed the last few turns in his mind, trying to picture the map to imagine where they had drifted off course. He had followed the directions on the flyer, taken the right fork, chosen the easier path. But the path had faded. The tracks had vanished. There had been no warning. He wondered if maybe the flyer had been outdated. Or worse, never meant to be followed in the first place. A marketing trick meant to lead tourists to nowhere. He rubbed his hands together and glanced toward the tent. The girls were sleeping soundly. He was grateful for that. They did not need to know how uncertain he felt. He would get them back on track. They would find a way out. He repeated it silently until it sounded like a fact. The air had cooled considerably by midnight. A sharp chill had replaced the day's heat, and Robert pulled an extra blanket around his shoulders. He listened to the sound of shifting dirt as some unseen animal moved beyond the reach of the flashlight. The night was alive with movement, but none of it human. He sat upright until his back stiffened, then finally crawled inside the tent beside his daughters. The space was cramped but warm. He lay on his side, staring at the nylon wall, his mind still ticking through possible routes and distances. Eventually, the exhaustion settled into his muscles, and sleep came not with peace but surrender. At dawn, the sky shifted again from purple to a pale gray. The sunlight filtered into the canyon, illuminating the rock walls with soft pink hues. Robert unzipped the tent and stepped outside. His breath came in faint clouds. The camp looked the same as it had the night before. The road was still gone. The ground still dry and cracked. He retrieved the remaining water from the cooler and set up a small breakfast using what they had left. Granola bars, dried fruit, a half-empty jar of peanut butter. Emily stirred first. She stepped outside with a grimace, brushing sleep from her eyes. June followed quieter than usual. Robert handed each of them a bottle of water and offered a tight smile. They ate slowly, seated on a flat patch of stone, the silence between them heavier than before. After breakfast, Robert packed the tent and supplies back into the car. He left the stove out, thinking they might need it again soon. He told the girls they would try to backtrack the way they came. Emily looked uncertain but nodded. June said nothing, holding tightly to her fox. Robert started the car and reversed down the trail they had followed the day before. The tires rolled cautiously over loose stone, then climbed the slope toward the fork. When they reached it, he paused. The left path still looked steep and unstable, but now it was their only option. He turned the wheel and began the climb. The incline was harsher than he remembered. The tires spun slightly on the dry gravel, and the vehicle lurched forward in short bursts. Emily gripped the door handle. June covered her eyes. Robert kept his foot steady on the gas. The car groaned as it climbed the engine, working harder with each foot. At the top of the slope, the ground leveled briefly, but the path ahead was worse. Large stones jutted up through the dirt, and sections of the trail had caved in along the edges. He drove for another quarter-mile before the right front tire struck something sharp, and the car jolted violently. He stopped the engine and stepped out. The tire was flat. A tear in the sidewall. He crouched beside it and ran his hand along the rubber. Not repairable. He opened the back hatch and retrieved the spare. As he worked, the morning sun climbed higher. Sweat broke across his neck and his hands trembled slightly from exertion. He changed the tire in silence. The girls waited inside, watching from behind the glass. When he finished, he tossed the damaged tire into the back and continued forward slower, now more cautious. The spare would not last long on terrain like this. Another hour passed, and the trail narrowed again. At one point, it forked without warning, both paths looking nearly identical. Robert paused again. He turned off the engine and stepped out. The land here looked barren even more than before. The wind had picked up, carrying loose dust and dry air. He walked a few yards in both directions, squinting into the distance. He thought he saw a rise in the land to the east, a possible roadbed. It was enough to justify another turn. He got back in and veered right. This new track twisted tightly between high rock walls, the canyon closing in around them. There was no space to turn around. The car scraped against sandstone in places. The trail dipped again, then curved left into a shallow wash. As they descended, the road became softer. The tires kicked up loose sand. Robert felt a tightness in his chest. This did not look like a road anymore. It looked like a dry riverbed. He slowed to a crawl. Then, without warning, the back tires sank. He pressed the accelerator, but the wheels spun in place, digging deeper. He tried again. Nothing. Sand kicked up behind them, but the car did not move. He put the car in reverse. The engine whined. The car lurched, but did not lift. He stopped, exhaled, turned to look at his daughters. Emily's face was pale. June looked confused. Robert stepped out again and walked around the vehicle. The back end was nearly buried up to the axle. He bent down and tried to scoop sand away with his hands. It slid back into place. He stood slowly, brushing his palms against his jeans. He looked up at the canyon walls. There were no signs of anything, no power lines, no tire marks, no distant engine noise. They were alone. The engine stopped completely this time. Robert turned the key once more out of habit, but the only reply was a low clicking sound. He removed his hand from the ignition and stared at the steering wheel. For a long moment he did not move. Outside, the canyon stood motionless, baked in the dull heat of late morning. The walls towered above them, reddish-brown and indifferent. Sand covered the rear tires nearly halfway up the wheel wells. A light breeze pushed fine dust against the windshield. Robert sat there with both hands on the wheel, breathing steadily, eyes fixed on nothing. The silence inside the vehicle pressed against him. Emily was watching him from the passenger seat. Her face was unreadable. June sat in the back, with the red fox pressed to her chest, eyes wide but dry. Robert said they would get out of this, but the words came slowly. His voice sounded thin. He reached for the door handle and stepped outside. The sand gave under his boots. He walked around to the rear and crouched down again, brushing away what he could with his bare hands. The grains clung to his fingers. Every scoop was undone by gravity. He stood and opened the rear hatch, pulling out the emergency shovel. It was small, more suited for snow than sand, but it was something. He worked in slow rhythms, clearing space behind each tire. Sweat rolled down the sides of his face. The heat was rising quickly. The sun was climbing toward its apex. He moved around the car, digging again. Every few minutes he stopped to drink from the water jug. By noon, he had cleared as much as he could. He placed the floor mats beneath the tires and climbed back into the driver's seat. He asked Emily to hold tight. He turned to the key. The engine started low and reluctant. He shifted into reverse and pressed gently on the gas. The tires spun, caught briefly, then sank again. A burst of sand shot into the air. The vehicle rocked slightly, then stopped moving. He turned off the engine and leaned back in the seat. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked toward the canyon opening. The trail ahead continued, but there was no way to know if it led anywhere. He told the girls they were not going to try driving again for now. Emily asked how much water they had left. He said enough for today and tomorrow if they were careful. June did not say anything. She unzipped her small backpack and pulled out a packet of crackers, offering one to her sister. Emily took it and smiled faintly. Robert stepped outside again and walked to the edge of the wash. He scanned the ridge above. No sign of movement. No dust trails. No shapes against the horizon. Just dry brushstone and empty sky. He turned back to the car and began setting up the tent again, using the same patch of hard ground they had stopped on the night before. There was no shade, but at least they would be outside the vehicle. They spent the afternoon inside the tent trying to stay cool. Robert kept the flap open for air, but the breeze was weak and carried dust. They ate sparingly. More crackers. a single apple divided between them. Emily sketched in her book. June slept off and on. Robert drank slowly from his bottle, calculating how much remained. He looked at the map again, but it was no longer helpful. The landmarks meant nothing now. The path they had followed had not been listed. He searched the folds of the flyer the clerk had given him. No useful information. Just pictures and vague promises of serenity. He thought about walking, leaving the girls in the tent while he searched for a better road or a higher ridge with signal, but the thought of leaving them alone gnawed at him. He told himself to wait. One more night. Someone might come down this way. There could be campers or off-roaders or even rangers. He decided to build a small signal fire in the evening, not too large, just enough to send smoke. As the sun began to lower, he gathered dry brush and arranged it near a flat stretch beside the tent. He kept the girls close while he lit it with the emergency fire starter. The smoke curled upward, thin and gray. It rose above the canyon for a few minutes, then drifted east with the wind. Robert watched it until the last ember cooled. The sky deepened into orange and then purple. The stars came again one by one. June asked if Mom could see them from heaven. Robert said he believed she could. Emily looked away. The night grew colder. Robert wrapped them in blankets and placed their sleeping bags closer together. He slept only in short stretches, waking at every sound, every change in the wind. Morning came with the first glow behind the rocks. Robert stepped out and scanned the trail again. Still no tracks. Still no sound. He decided to climb a little higher. He filled a small pack with water, a flashlight, and the folded map. He left a note for Emily inside the tent written in pen on a napkin, telling her he would be back by midday. He told her to stay inside the tent with June and to keep drinking water slowly. He said he loved them. Then he zipped the tent and started walking toward the east ridge. The climb was not steep, but the heat made every step harder. His boots slipped in the sand. Sweat soaked through his shirt. The higher he climbed, the less he could see of the path behind. The canyon narrowed below him, and the tent became a small speck. He reached a ridge and turned, slowly scanning the horizon for anything. Nothing. No fences, no towers, no roads. Just open land. He took out his phone again and held it up. No signal. He raised it higher. Still nothing. He lowered it, placed it back in the pack, and sat on a flat stone. He drank from his bottle and rubbed the back of his neck. He sat there for almost 10 minutes, hoping for sound. Hoping for anything. Finally, he stood and walked back down. Each step kicked loose dust. His calves burned. The air felt heavier now. When he reached the tent, Emily was outside, squinting against the light. June was still sleeping. He told Emily there was no signal, no road. He smiled and said they would try a different plan tomorrow. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He stepped into the tent and sat down beside his youngest daughter, brushing a hand through her hair. Outside, the wind picked up again. By mid-morning, the heat had thickened the air in the canyon. It pressed against skin and slowed movement, making even simple tasks feel like effort. Robert Kincaid sat just outside the tent, arms resting on his knees, watching the light shimmer across the sand. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat. The girls were still inside, sheltering from the sun. Emily had been quiet since he returned from the ridge. She had not asked questions, not even when he shook his head and said nothing useful could be seen. June had drawn a sun with a stick in the dirt, then fallen asleep again beneath the flap's shadow. The water jug was down to less than a third. Robert had rationed their sips that morning, passing bottles in silence and measuring each mouthful in his head. The food had also begun to dwindle. 2 apples remained along with dry cereal, a few energy bars, and the last pack of crackers. He reminded himself that panic would not feed them. Calm thinking might. By noon, the wind had picked up slightly. It swept across the canyon floor, carrying dust in low spirals. Robert used a corner of his shirt to wipe grit from his eyes. He had started to think again about walking out. Not just scouting, but leaving and going far enough to reach a road or a ranger station. The thought of walking through that dry wash with no clear direction made his stomach knot. Yet, staying longer in one place brought a different kind of risk. The sun would only grow stronger the water less. He stood and walked to the edge of the trail again. The sand showed only their footprints, nothing else. He turned back to the tent, pulling the stove from the pack and lighting it with the last of the fuel. He boiled a bit of water and poured it into 2 cups with instant noodles, letting the heat soften them. He gave one to Emily and one to June, who had woken up again with a dry cough. Robert sipped his slowly, unsure if the warmth made him feel better or worse. The afternoon wore on in near silence. Emily flipped through her sketchbook but did not draw. Her pencil rested in her hand, unmoving. June leaned against her father's arm, her eyes half closed. Robert could feel her pulse through the thin skin of her wrist. He checked it out of habit, out of worry. Her forehead was warm. Not hot, but warm enough to make him wonder. The water situation weighed heavier than it had in the morning. He counted again in his mind, measured how long they might last if no help came. He had seen no planes, no distant movement. The signal fire had drifted away on wind. He thought about lighting another, but he had used most of the dry brush already. There were only scattered twigs left, not enough to make anything visible from far away. The canyon had swallowed all their attempts to be noticed. As the day grew later, Robert decided to explore further down the wash alone. He asked Emily to stay by the tent and gave her the flashlight just in case the shadows grew faster than expected. He left her with 1 bottle of water and told her to only open it if June asked for it directly. Then he started walking, his boots crunching across dry earth. The canyon walls loomed on both sides, casting long shadows across the trail. The light filtered through high gaps, painting bands of brightness across the floor. Robert moved steadily, his breathing shallow but even. Each step took him farther from the tent, from the only place that still resembled safety. After 30 minutes, the trail began to shift again. It dipped and rose, winding into unfamiliar turns. At one point, he saw what looked like old tire marks, faint but real. His heart lifted slightly. He followed them for another few hundred feet, but they ended abruptly at a rockfall half buried by sand. He stood there a while, staring at the broken stone. He could not say if the marks were recent or if they had been left months ago. A breeze swept through the canyon and moved his shirt against his back. He turned and walked back slower, now his legs starting to ache. The sand dragged at his steps. The sun leaned lower in the sky. When he finally reached the tent again, Emily looked up but said nothing. Robert sat down and drank 2 small sips from the water bottle. June had fallen asleep again, her face flushed. That night, they stayed inside the tent. No fire, no sound. Just wind brushing against the nylon like fingertips. Robert lay awake for hours, eyes fixed on the curved ceiling. He thought about Claire. He remembered the way she had always packed the cooler, how she labeled everything, how she made sure the maps were folded perfectly. He wished he had asked her more questions. He wished she had been there. When he finally drifted to sleep, it was not deep. He dreamed of water dripping from a faucet that would not turn off. The next morning brought no relief. The air felt heavier. The wind had stilled. June was slow to wake and barely touched her breakfast. Emily offered her half of an apple, and she took it without a word. Robert checked the jug. Barely enough left for a single day. He knew what had to happen. He would leave early tomorrow and head south, hoping the direction would lead him toward civilization. He had studied the sun's arc, the canyon's curve, and the slope of the land. South was the best guess. Not the safest, but the best. He spent the day preparing the pack. He set aside 1 bottle of water for the walk, wrapped 2 granola bars in foil, and packed the map, the flashlight, and the lighter. He told Emily the plan. She listened, nodding slowly. She did not ask him not to go. She only asked when he thought he might return. Robert said he would try to be back by nightfall, but if not, she should stay in the tent with June until morning. Emily understood. That night, he wrote a short note and left it under a rock near the trail. It listed their names, the date, and their condition. If anyone found it, they would know who had been there. He folded it carefully and weighed it down with a flat stone. Then he returned to the tent and slept for a few quiet hours, holding June's hand and watching the stars shift slowly through the sky. At first light, Robert Kincaid stood near the base of the ridge shoulders, squared a small pack slung tightly over his back, and eyes fixed on the narrow trail leading away from the campsite. The stillness of morning made everything feel delicate, as if the air itself might shatter beneath one misstep. The decision to leave had been made not out of impulse, but from the heavy understanding that waiting any longer would only deepen their isolation. He had considered every direction and had come to believe that the best chance of reaching help lay somewhere beyond the southern stretch of canyon. With only one bottle of water, 2 granola bars, a folded topographical map, and the last working flashlight tucked inside his pack, he walked away from the tent, hoping his girls would remain safe long enough for him to return with answers, or at least direction. Emily had not cried when he explained the plan again that morning, though her hands had trembled slightly as she tucked the blanket more firmly around her sister's legs. June had not woken fully. Her face had looked pale, her lips dry, and her voice almost too soft to hear. Robert had kissed her forehead, spoken words he did not repeat, then turned to Emily and asked her to stay inside the tent during the heat of the day to ration the water and to keep the flap open for airflow, but zipped enough to keep the dust out. He told her that he expected to return before nightfall, but warned her that if he was not back, she must remain where she was and wait until the second morning before making any decisions. With a quiet nod, Emily promised him she would wait. The first few miles passed underfoot with deceptive ease. The trail sloped downward at a comfortable angle, the rock beneath him flat and dry, but not yet loose enough to slow progress. Robert moved with the steady pace of someone who had no time to waste, but also could not afford exhaustion. He paused every 30 minutes to drink a measured sip of water, listening to the sound of his breath as it bounced between the canyon walls. The sun climbed gradually but with increasing intensity, casting long streaks of light over the cliff edges, making the landscape ahead flicker with heat. The silence of the canyon became sharper as the morning wore on. He heard only the crunch of his boots and the occasional rustle of wind shifting through distant brush. Around mid-morning, Robert reached a split in the wash where 2 narrow paths diverged between sets of low ridges. He studied the terrain carefully, removing the map from his pocket, though it offered little guidance on the detail of these dry riverbeds. He chose the route that appeared more compacted, where the soil seemed less disturbed, and the brush thinned just enough to suggest occasional foot traffic, or perhaps remnants of old tire tracks. As he moved forward, he noticed faint signs that something or someone had once passed this way: an old bottle cap, half buried in dust, a piece of string snagged on a dry branch, and what might have been the sole imprint of a boot near a bend in the trail. Whether these signs offered hope or misdirection, he could not say, but they gave him reason to continue. As the sun climbed higher and the heat became more oppressive, Robert began to feel the tight pull of dehydration around his temples. His mouth grew dry no matter how slowly he sipped water, and his legs began to ache with a dull, deep fatigue. He stopped under a shallow overhang and crouched for a moment, letting the shade soothe the heat trapped in his skin. He pulled 1 granola bar from his pack, unwrapped it slowly, and chewed with difficulty, the dryness of the food almost choking in his throat. He forced it down with 2 gulps of water and sat still until the dizziness eased. The canyon felt longer than he had imagined. Every turn looked like the last. The distances blurred. Still, he pressed forward, driven not by confidence but by the sheer necessity of it. In the early afternoon, just past a low ridge that crumbled under his boots, he spotted something unexpected on the horizon, a flash of reflection, brief but distinct, caught by the sun. He climbed the slope cautiously and found embedded in the sand the rusted remains of what had once been a road sign, its paint faded and illegible, bent forward as if bowing to time. Near it lay 2 crushed cans, both sun-bleached and dry. The remnants gave no promise of direction, but they marked that humans had once passed here. Robert stood there staring at the objects, willing them to speak, to tell him where to go next. When they remained silent, he adjusted his pack and continued south, now moving across terrain that felt a little more forgiving. By late afternoon, the heat reached its worst. The air shimmered against the rocks, and Robert's vision began to blur at the edges. His steps became slower, more deliberate. The water was nearly gone. He had not spoken aloud in hours, but inside his mind the words moved constantly. He thought of Emily's eyes, steady and brave. He thought of June's voice as it faded into sleep. He thought of Claire's handwriting on the back of an old photo, the one he had kept in his wallet for years, and had left inside the glove compartment. He thought of the road that should have led them to Flagstaff and how a single turn had undone everything. As the sun dipped lower and the sky began to shift toward amber, Robert found himself near a bluff overlooking a wide stretch of land. In the distance, he saw what looked like the outline of a fence line, straight and unnatural against the otherwise wild landscape. Hope stirred faintly. He descended carefully, every muscle aching, and moved closer. When he reached the fence, he placed a hand on its wire. It was real. He followed it west for nearly half a mile before spotting the slanted roof of a small structure beyond a dry creek. It was not a house, but it stood with walls and shade. Robert approached it with shaking legs, each step heavier than the last. Inside the structure, which appeared to be an abandoned maintenance shed, he found a broken bench and a rusted metal cabinet. There was no radio, no signal, and no stored supplies, but the shade alone felt like a small victory. He sat on the floor, breathing through cracked lips, thinking only of the direction he had come from. He needed to rest before trying to return. He closed his eyes for a moment, not because he wanted sleep, but because his body demanded it. When Robert Kincaid opened his eyes, the world outside the shed had shifted. The sky no longer burned with light, but had cooled into the final tones of dusk. A breeze stirred through the doorway, bringing with it the dry scent of sage and dust. For a few seconds, he did not move. The ache in his legs had stiffened into something deeper, and his throat felt raw from thirst. He sat upright slowly, wincing as he shifted weight from his right side, which had been pressed against the concrete floor. The pack lay beside him, half empty, the flashlight tucked beneath a folded corner. He reached for the water bottle out of habit, but the last swallow was gone before sundown. The thought of returning to the canyon now under moonlight and fatigue felt almost impossible. But the idea of Emily and June waiting for him in that tent, unaware of how far he had come, or how long he would remain away, made the silence unbearable. He stood carefully, steadying himself against the edge of the cabinet. The stars were beginning to appear outside, scattered across a deepening sky. There were no sounds of traffic, no lights on the horizon. The shed had given him temporary shelter, but it offered no path forward. If help existed, it would be beyond this fence line, farther than the eye could reach. He walked outside and followed the fence west for another few minutes until he saw faintly against the distance what appeared to be a series of worn vehicle tracks in the dirt, not fresh, but deep enough to suggest regular passage. He turned, retraced his steps back to the shed, and sat again to think. The right choice was still unclear. Back in the canyon, Emily held the flashlight in one hand and kept the flap of the tent slightly open with the other. The sky had dimmed to navy, and the shapes of the rocks were turning into silhouettes. June slept next to her, curled into a small circle beneath the blanket. Her breathing had changed, becoming slower, heavier. Emily had given her the last of the water, just before sundown, hoping it would keep her body from drying out too quickly during the night. She had read the note again that her father left and placed it under her pillow. She did not cry, but she felt each minute pass with an ache that settled in her stomach and made her chest tight. She did not sleep. She waited. Robert knew he had to choose before the night grew colder. The longer he stayed, the less time he would have to return before sunrise. He checked the map again by flashlight, though it no longer offered guidance. He had passed the point where markings matched the land. He folded it again and placed it inside his pack. He turned east, facing the direction of the wash, and began walking. His steps were deliberate, not quick. Every part of his body resisted movement, but his mind pushed him forward. He focused on counting each 100 steps a small milestone. The stars overhead grew brighter. Coyotes called in the far distance. His flashlight beam danced over stones and brush. Somewhere past midnight, after countless bends and shallow climbs, Robert reached a slope he remembered. He paused, there leaned against a stone, and let his breath settle. His lips cracked when he tried to wet them with his tongue. He descended slowly into the wash, his legs threatening to give beneath him, but he remained upright. He passed the rock fall he had climbed earlier that day and recognized the place where the path had split into two trails. When he reached the flat stretch near the edge of the canyon, the moonlight revealed something unexpected. A shape in the sand. A line of small footprints. They did not belong to him. He followed them quietly, heart thudding. They veered slightly off the trail and circled a boulder, then continued toward the wash. His pulse quickened. He moved faster. The prints became clearer as he walked smaller than his spaced close together. As he turned the next bend, he saw her. Emily. She stood beside a stone flashlight raised in both hands, her eyes wide as the light fell over his face. She did not speak at first. She simply ran toward him, and for the first time in days he let his arms fall around someone and he did not let go. They sat down together on a patch of bare ground, while Robert tried to breathe evenly. He asked why she had left the tent. She said June had started shivering and would not wake fully. She had waited until midnight, and when he did not return, she decided to follow the path, leaving a rock pattern at the tent's entrance in case someone came looking. Robert listened and nodded. He was too tired to scold, too relieved to feel anger. He told her they had found a structure, shade, a fence line. It was not much, but it was better than the tent. She asked if they would go now. He shook his head. He needed to rest again just for a while before he could carry June if needed. Together, they walked back toward the tent. The flashlight began to dim as they approached. Inside, June stirred when Robert knelt beside her. She opened her eyes briefly, then closed them again. He lifted her slowly, wrapping her in the blanket, and carried her outside. Emily followed close behind, clutching the red fox and the sketchbook. The walk back to the shed took hours. Robert staggered more than once, but Emily steadied him each time. The sun was barely rising when the shed came into view again. Robert laid June inside first, then sat against the wall and let his head fall back. Emily sat beside him, leaning into his shoulder. He did not speak. The sky brightened. The silence changed. A low hum began to rise from the horizon. Robert stood weakly, walked outside, and squinted toward the east. Dust rose in the distance, movement, a shape. The sound of a motor grew clearer. He lifted his arm and waved. The sound came before the shape became clear, rising steadily from the east, like a memory reassembling itself in the morning light. Robert Kincaid stood in the doorway of the shed, one hand gripping the frame to keep his balance, his other raised slowly, deliberately, as the low growl of an engine climbed across the desert floor. The vehicle appeared as a shimmer, at first a glint of metal in motion against the haze traveling along the outer boundary of the fence line. As it drew closer, the outline of a truck became visible, dust-caked, sun-bleached, and unfamiliar, but unmistakably real. It moved slowly, scanning the terrain with careful purpose. Robert stepped further into the open and raised both arms, waving with everything he had left. His shoulders burned. His breath caught in his chest. For a moment, the truck did not slow. Then the engine softened, the tires slowed, and the driver cut sharply toward the shed. Emily stood just behind her father, clutching the red fox to her chest, her eyes never leaving the vehicle as it came to a halt. The door creaked open, and a man in his 40s stepped out, sun-darkened and dressed in faded work clothes. He said he was with the utility crew checking the integrity of the fence line for the county. His eyes moved from Robert to Emily, then to the doorway where June still slept, wrapped in a blanket on the concrete floor. His expression changed quickly. He told them to wait while he reached for a radio inside the truck. Robert nodded, but said nothing. His throat could not carry words anymore. He simply lowered his arms and let his body rest against the frame of the shed. It took less than 5 minutes for the man to radio in their location. He offered Robert a bottle of water, which he opened with shaking fingers and drank in careful sips. He gave a second bottle to Emily, who offered it first to her sister before drinking herself. The man opened the truck's side compartment and pulled out a small emergency cooler. Inside were protein bars, sports drinks, and a basic first aid kit. He knelt beside June and checked her pulse, then glanced up at Robert and said the girl needed fluids soon. Robert nodded again. He did not have the strength for anything else. The man gave her a drink, cradling her neck as she swallowed. When her eyes opened, she looked toward Robert, and he could see her lips move, forming his name. The driver told them that an emergency response team had been dispatched from the nearest ranger station. He said it would take at least 40 minutes for them to arrive given the condition of the back roads. He offered to take them part way, but Robert refused to leave until the rescue team arrived. He explained, slowly pausing between sentences, that they had spent too many days unseen. He did not want to move again unless someone official marked it down. He wanted there to be a record. He wanted someone to know exactly where they had been found. The man nodded, understanding. He did not argue. They sat together under a makeshift tarp the driver tied from the shed to the hood of the truck. The shade gave them a small corner of comfort, just enough to breathe without the heat cutting into their lungs. June rested across Emily's lap, sipping water slowly. Her eyes stayed open now. Her skin had begun to cool. Robert remained seated near the wheel while legs stretched out, watching the sky. Every now and then he would close his eyes, not to sleep, but to hold back the burn of emotion that kept rising inside him like smoke. The man told them his name was Calvin. He said he almost skipped that section of the fence because it was far from the route. He had decided at the last minute to check it before returning to the main road. Robert thanked him with a nod. By the time the ranger team arrived, the sun had climbed high again. A helicopter passed overhead once before circling back and landing in a flat patch of earth near the wash. 2 trucks followed, arriving in tandem, raising clouds of dust as they pulled to a stop beside the shed. Rangers and medics emerged quickly. They asked questions and moved with quiet efficiency. One medic examined June and helped Emily onto a stretcher. Another offered Robert a space to lie down, but he declined. He walked to the tent they had set up inside the shed and pointed to the map in his pack, tracing the path they had followed. He showed them the flyer from the gas station. He described the canyon in detail. He gave names, dates, times. He did not want to forget anything. A ranger named Garcia stayed beside Robert while the others loaded his daughters into the helicopter. She had a clipboard in one hand and a calm, steady voice. She asked if he remembered the date they first turned off the highway. He told her it was a Tuesday because they had left Fort Collins after breakfast, and his sister had texted him about the reunion the day before. Garcia wrote everything down, nodding slowly. She told him that the place they had been found was not on most maps, and that the wash they had entered had been closed off after a flash flood several years earlier. The sign that had once marked the closure had washed away in a storm. When the helicopter lifted off, Robert stood and watched it until the shape faded into the brightness. Then he turned back to Calvin's truck and climbed inside. Garcia sat beside him, saying the other vehicles would follow behind. He looked through the window at the land they were leaving behind. The canyon had returned to silence as if nothing had happened. The tire tracks would fade. The footprints would vanish in wind. But he would remember. The hospital room was quiet, except for the faint hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps from the hallway beyond. Robert Kincaid sat in a plastic chair beside the bed, his arms, crossed eyes fixed on the IV drip, slowly delivering hydration into his younger daughter's arm. June lay still, breathing evenly now, her skin no longer pale, but flushed with a soft hint of color. She had eaten a spoonful of broth that morning, and the nurse had marked it down with quiet satisfaction. Emily slept in the bed across the room, turned toward the wall, her sketchbook beside her pillow, a drawing half-finished and smudged at the corners. Robert had not slept since they arrived the day before. The adrenaline had faded, but his body would not surrender to rest. He watched the steady rise and fall of his daughter's breathing, the only rhythm that mattered now. Doctors had said it would take a few more days of fluids and observation before they could be cleared for travel. None of them had suffered permanent damage, but dehydration had pushed June dangerously close to a point of no return. They had lost weight, lost time, lost parts of themselves that would take longer to find than any trail out of the canyon. A social worker had visited that morning, asking questions in a careful, gentle tone. She had wanted to know how they ended up so far off course, why Robert had taken an unmarked road, whether the decision had been made out of impulse or ignorance. Robert had answered each question with full sentences and quiet honesty. He had told her he believed the route was safe, that he had prepared as best he could, that he had not panicked when things began to go wrong. Not at first. When she left, he had remained seated by the bed. Garcia, the ranger who had stayed with him at the shed, had called the hospital and asked to speak with him. She told him over the phone that their case had been officially recorded as a survival incident, not a search and rescue failure. She said his notes and memory had helped complete a report on a stretch of land that had been missing from updated maps for years. He thanked her, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He did not feel like a survivor. He felt like a man who had walked just far enough not to vanish. Later that afternoon, Emily woke and asked where her phone was. Robert handed it to her, cleaned and charged. She'd stared at the screen for a long time before opening her messages. Dozens of missed calls, texts, voicemails. She read a few before placing the phone face down on the tray beside her bed. She said she wanted to go home. Robert told her they would be discharged in 2 days if things continued to improve. June stirred in her bed and asked for a juice box. Robert retrieved it from the small fridge beside the door and watched her drink with slow, deliberate sips. Her hands were steadier now. She smiled after the third sip and said she wanted pancakes. He promised her they would find the best pancakes in the state as soon as the doctors allowed it. That evening, a reporter from the local paper requested a short interview. Robert declined. The hospital staff said they would block all outside inquiries unless he changed his mind. He had no interest in turning their ordeal into a story for strangers. He did not want to see his daughters' names on headlines or watch their faces appear beside dramatic words. He did not want his mistake turned into a cautionary tale. The ranger station had released a basic summary to the Press family located after 3 days missing no fatalities, extreme heat exposure. That was enough. The rest belonged to them. In the small hours of the next morning, Robert finally fell asleep in the chair. A nurse found him with his arms crossed, chin resting against his shoulder, snoring quietly. When he woke, the sky outside had turned pale with early light. Emily was drawing again. June was flipping through a picture book the nurses had brought. The television remained off. They did not need background noise. Life itself had returned slowly, carefully, like something fragile being lowered back into place. The doctor came in just after breakfast and told Robert they would be released the next morning, pending one last round of hydration tests. Robert thanked him and stood for the first time in hours to stretch. His legs ached, but it felt good to stand. That afternoon, Garcia came to visit in person. She brought a manila envelope with the official report and a copy of the updated map now marked with a red X at the spot where the family had been found. She placed it on the table and asked if Robert wanted to keep it. He nodded and said yes, because the mark was proof they had existed there, proof they had not disappeared. Garcia sat for a few minutes talking with Emily and June, asking them what they remembered. Emily said she remembered the stars and the sound of her father digging in the sand. June said she remembered the fox staying warm under the blanket. Garcia smiled, said they were strong, and stood to leave. That night, Robert took the envelope and stepped out into the hallway. He sat near the window at the end overlooking the city below. The lights blinked in quiet rhythm. Cars moved along empty streets, and somewhere beyond the buildings was a road that would lead them home. He unfolded the map again, stared at the route they had followed, and traced it backward with his finger. Each turn now looked obvious. Each decision stood out. He closed the map, folded it neatly, and placed it back into the envelope. He would keep it not to remember the fear, but to remember the return. The next morning arrived with a hush that seemed deliberate, as if even the hospital had agreed to give the family a moment of quiet before the movement began. The nurse entered softly, checked vitals with gentle hands, and whispered to Robert that the discharge papers were ready whenever they were. He nodded, then turned toward his daughters, who were both awake, sitting upright in their beds, already dressed in the fresh clothes a volunteer had dropped off the evening before. Emily was lacing her sneakers, her hair tied back, her sketchbook zipped tightly into her backpack. June sat beside her with the red fox tucked under one arm, her legs dangling off the side of the mattress, her face calmer than it had been in weeks. Robert exhaled slowly as he stood from the chair where he had spent the better part of 4 days, running fingers through his unshaved beard and stretching limbs that still ached from dehydration and strain. He helped June down gently, then placed his hand on Emily's shoulder as they stepped together into the hallway. The paperwork took less than an hour. A nurse reviewed the medications, a caseworker handed Robert a list of follow-up appointments, and the hospital's administrator offered transportation vouchers, all in a tone that tried to be both efficient and kind. Robert accepted everything with quiet gratitude. Outside the building, the sky was overcast, casting a silver sheen across the parking lot. A car waited at the curb engine, running a local volunteer from the recovery program who would take them to the nearby hotel arranged for their first night out. Robert thanked the driver as they climbed inside, settling into seats that felt too soft after so many nights on hard ground and firm mattresses. The drive was short, but strangely long, each stoplight stretching into something slower than time. Robert looked out the window as they passed by rows of fast food restaurants, pharmacies, gas stations, and strip malls. Each building stood straight and clean, ordinary in the way only those who had not disappeared could afford to be. The hotel lobby smelled like lemon polish and warm coffee. The desk clerk smiled with practiced ease and handed over a room key without asking questions. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Robert led the girls inside, watching the numbers change as they rose. Their room was simple 2 beds with white linens, a small table with 2 chairs, and a television mounted near the ceiling. June picked the bed near the window and placed her fox on the pillow. Emily opened the curtain slightly, letting the gray light settle across the carpet. Robert sat on the edge of the second bed and exhaled into his hands. He felt the stillness of it all press around him like insulation. No sound of birds, no wind. No sand beneath his boots, just air conditioning and thick carpet and the weight of what they had left behind. They spent the day indoors. Emily watched cartoons without sound, her sketchbook open again but unused. June napped twice, eating crackers between sleep, her color continuing to return in gentle shades. Robert called his sister and gave her the update. They were safe. They would return home in 2 days. She offered to drive out and bring them back herself, but Robert declined. He said he wanted to make the trip home slow, not fast. She did not argue. That evening, he walked to the lobby alone and bought 3 bottled waters and a pack of cereal bars. The girl behind the counter asked if he needed anything else. He smiled and said no. As he returned to the room, he paused in the hallway and leaned against the wall. His legs felt strong again, but his thoughts remained heavy. The map with the red X sat in his backpack. He had looked at it only once since leaving the hospital. He was not ready to unfold it again. On the second day, they visited a nearby park. The grass was green and too flat. Children played on a jungle gym. Parents watched from benches with iced coffee and cell phones. Robert sat with Emily while June swung gently beside them, her laughter faint but present. Emily said she wanted to write about what happened, but not yet. She wanted to wait until her hand stopped shaking when she thought about it. Robert said that was fine. He said the story belonged to them and could wait as long as it needed to. That night in the hotel room, Emily finally opened her sketchbook and began to draw again. Not the canyon, not the truck, just faces. Hers, her sister's, her father's, all of them facing forward. On the third day, Robert picked up the rental car. It was silver and clean and came with GPS and a fresh bottle of windshield fluid. He loaded their bags into the trunk and held the door open for the girls. June climbed in first, still holding the red fox. Emily followed, placing her sketchbook on the seat beside her. Robert started the engine and looked once more in the rearview mirror before pulling out of the lot. The road back to Fort Collins stretched ahead in long lines and steady curves. He followed the signs, stayed on the highway, and stopped often. At rest stops, they walked together and watched the world pass by through clean windows. They said little, but the silence now felt different. It was no longer filled with fear or regret. It was filled with understanding. When they finally reached home, the house looked smaller than Robert remembered. The front steps had weeds growing between the cracks. The porch light had burned out. Inside, the air smelled still and untouched. Emily opened the living room window while Robert checked the fridge, and June wandered to her old bedroom where her drawings still hung on the wall. Robert unpacked slowly. The tent went into the garage, the stove into the kitchen drawer, the map into the top drawer of his desk beneath a stack of old photographs. That night, they ate frozen pizza and watched an old movie, the three of them huddled together on the couch like they had been before. The city outside moved on without them, unaware of what they had found, unaware of what they had left in the canyon. In the weeks that followed, the family resumed pieces of their old life. Robert returned to work part-time. Emily went back to school and mostly kept to herself. June began drawing again, focusing mainly on animals and trees. The story did not spread far. A few friends knew what had happened. A few neighbors asked questions, but the family offered only simple explanations. They said it was a wrong turn followed by long days and eventually a safe return. The details remained private and belonged only to them. In the evenings, Robert started writing again. He did not write for publication. Instead, he wrote to preserve memories. He wrote about how silence feels heavier when no one is listening. He described the rhythm of footsteps in sand and explained how it feels when you no longer trust the road beneath you. He recalled the moment when his daughter walked toward him in the dark, holding a flashlight that trembled in her hands. He reflected on how hope sometimes arrives as quietly as a layer of dust. They did not forget the canyon. They did not speak of it every day, but it lived in them. Not as trauma, not even as warning, but as something that shaped them without permission. When people asked where they had gone, they said they had been lost for a while. And when asked how they found their way back, they said they kept walking until they saw each other again. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did you think about the journey this family faced, and where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know below.